now to talk more about these 75 years of NATO, this huge transatlantic success story. We're honored to welcome Daniel Speckhard, former top NATO official and former U.S. ambassador to Belarus. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you here. So you spent years working for NATO, and from your perspective, looking back at everything that happened and whatever's happening right now and what could possibly happen, is now one of the more challenging times for the alliance, you think?
Well, I think certainly it is, in the context that your Atlantic alliance has been set up to protect the Euro-Atlantic space in a security way. And obviously, with a war in Ukraine right near its borders, that's a very difficult position to be in. At the same time, I think the alliance is feeling very good about the idea that we are still together, that when people were thinking about what was the future of the alliance at the 50th birthday party, and people were hoping that we wouldn't have to be in this position of being such a strong defensive alliance. I think now that issue has been settled, and once again we see there is a great, great value of having democracies come together to jointly protect and defend their democracies.
Yeah, and this is all very good, and we're obviously very much marking this occasion with a lot of fanfare, a lot of maybe muted fanfare given where we are currently in geopolitics. I just want to share a couple of also tweets from certain leaders and certain governments that have been going around the net today. The first one is from Prime Minister Kaja Kallas from Estonia. I think that's going to be shared with our viewers now. This tweet very much congratulating the alliance, marking positive words. You see it there now. So obviously an ardent supporter of NATO, especially being up there in the Baltic states. They know full well what that means. Her own personal story also very much a reminder of that. Then another tweet really quickly. Let's show that next one also from Germany, which we can also see congratulatory words. And also we can see there NATO flag flying in various institutions there across Berlin. I believe that's the German Chancellor there on the bottom left, and the Bundestag. So important day. But then I just want to share that next one. So we have a lot of celebration, but immediately let's just show the next one from Hungary. So this is Zoltán Kovács. This is the spokesperson for Mr. Orbán. And here we see a lot of negativity, and I think it's just the first line I want to read out to you. Foreign Minister Gerardo warned of a significant escalation risk due to the prevailing war psychosis within NATO. And it goes on with not so nice words. So when you have, when you have those strong words, is perhaps one of the biggest threats not from the outside, but maybe from within?
Well, this has always been the challenge of NATO, which is it's an alliance based on consensus. And now that you have 32 countries compared to the 12 when they started, that's a much more difficult task. And so things are much more difficult in getting that consensus. There are a lot more opinions than when you have a very small group. But at the end of the day, the extra work that it takes to get consensus is worth it. You saw that as Sweden was asking to become a member. It took much longer than many members had hoped for that to happen because some of the members raised some concerns. But over time, through talk, dialogue, understanding, the NATO alliance welcomed Sweden in. So what I see continually happening in the alliance is people underestimate it because it is a multilateral forum. But compared really to any other multilateral forum in the world, it's probably one of the most effective and efficient. And the fact that one or two members are nervous or frustrated based on their own domestic politics or their own political or security situations for that individual country should not surprise us.
It seems to be the case that we've been trying to dissect whatever's been happening with NATO and its expansion as well. How about we now focus on major achievements? If you were to say, what are some of the major achievements that we should really celebrate on this 75th birthday?
Well, I think 75 is a big number. Remember the last century where we had 2 world wars in that 100-year period. And NATO was meant to create a defensive alliance that would deter aggression against its states. And I think they've done that very well now over 75 years. And that has meant stability for those members of those NATO countries and for those European countries in particular, and for the strength of the U.S.-European relationship. So I think they can really celebrate that. In addition, I would highlight the Balkans, right? This is an area that over multiple centuries has continually had conflict and wars. And as a result of the heavy engagement of NATO, the Balkans is at peace. They have worked through a lot of tough issues. I was also ambassador to Greece and can tell you the issue with North Macedonia and Greece was a difficult and challenging one. They came to a conclusion through that dialogue, conversation, and negotiation, and now they are a member of NATO. So I really see peace in the Balkans as one of the major success stories of that 75 years.
But I'm going to counter with a bit of a challenge here to you now, Daniel, because it was only, I think, ever once that Article 5 was actually activated. That was the terrible September 11th strikes in 2001 when the alliance came forward. And we had, of course, that contingent, the forces that were then deployed to Afghanistan, ISAF, over 20 years. That, unfortunately, did end poorly for not just the new Afghani government, but also for those NATO countries that were involved there. So I'm just wondering, that you mentioned the Balkans, but here we mentioned the only time Article 5 was used. So does that make it more concerning that Article 5 potentially is in jeopardy for future?
No, I don't think so. I think most of the NATO allies understand the difficulty of Afghanistan, that particular context. That has been a country that has suffered challenges over literally centuries. And the reality of the problem there is there was so much outside interference and influence in that effort to have a peacekeeping mission there that it ended up not being successful. But I don't think allies today look at that as not a worthwhile effort, or at least a noble cause. When you look at what's happening to the rights of women and children in that country today, what's happening just in general in the security situation and the overall economic situation, the hunger that is pervasive now, what we were trying to do there and achieve, which is to support a nascent democracy in Afghanistan, was a worthwhile mission. And unfortunately, there were quite a number of outside actors who were not wanting to see NATO and its allies succeed in that. And they worked hard to make sure that didn't happen. And now the people of Afghanistan are suffering as a result.
So we are living in a very particular time. Only a few minutes ago, we spoke about a dismantling of network of Russian spies in the EU and how they could potentially, bring some troubles within the EU. So let's take a look at NATO. How do you think that NATO could protect itself, knowing well enough that Russia might be potentially trying to infiltrate it?
Well, I think the most important thing is that there's strong sharing of intelligence. It's always challenging because when you get that many countries at different levels of their intelligence protection, sometimes you can't share the full amount of intelligence across all the allies. But I think more people understand the situation, what's going on, and what's at stake, the more able the politicians and political leaders and military leaders are able to make good decisions. The reality is, as Poles know very well, Russia hasn't really changed its stripes here in terms of its leadership. And covert operations by Russia are the standard operation procedure. It's not surprising given where their president has come from. And we need to be very vigilant. The reality is, democracies are more vulnerable than autocracies when it comes to these kinds of things because you have lots of laws, lots of processes that protect oftentimes those who try to act nefariously in our system because we're not willing to sacrifice our democratic and human right principles. So we have to work extra hard to protect ourselves against those kinds of nefarious attacks. And so far, I think they've been doing a relatively good job.
Mm. I'm curious also about your own history, Daniel. I mean, you began working, I think it was under the tenure of Lord Robertson back in 2003, I believe. You've seen the work of that Secretary General and just generally how that role has changed. I mean, now Mr. Stoltenberg, the longest serving, he's everywhere in terms of appearances, going around the world. How is in your mind, in your experience, how has that role now evolved and changed from when you started working for NATO?
I think the most significant thing is, given that there are now 32 members, the NATO Secretary General's role in terms of Euro-Atlantic security is really at the top and allows him or her to be in a much stronger position in terms of encouraging and engaging all of the different member states and representing NATO to outside states. You know, when I was there, we had 16 members. When I started in 19, it was a much more difficult time because you had the European Union, which had its, and still does have its own European collective capabilities. And that kind of competition sometimes in that made the voice of where the voice of that Euro-Atlantic, particularly the European perspective, was coming from sometimes not as clear. I think now it's easier for the Secretary General representing 32 countries to kind of step forward, take that leadership position, and work very closely with the European Union and the United States in that connective tissue that makes sure that these voices go forward in a very consensual way.
Mm-hmm. As we're on the subject of Secretary General, obviously there might be some changes there happening sometime soon. What are your predictions? What do you think? Who might become the next Secretary General based on your experience within the alliance?
Well, I'm not going to get into the middle of the politics of that because it's always very, a very important issue who you choose for that role. It needs to be someone. I can just talk a little bit about the types of attributes.
Okay, so then let me rephrase the question. What do you think the next Secretary General, what kind of traits does he have to have in order to be, or she has to have in order to be able to deal with all these challenges that NATO has to go against these days?
Well, first I can say it could very well be a she. I've worked for 4 women secretaries of state in my career at the U.S. government. So there are plenty of very qualified women out there as well. But I think the most important trait is this person is going to have to be seen as someone who has great capability to go to any capital in the world and understand the dynamics across the table and then be able to project the interest of NATO with that interaction. And in particular, what I'm talking about is this balance between interest in peace as well as the ability to project power, right? There's an old saying that a conflict avoided can be a conflict multiplied, right? And the history of Europe has plenty of appeasement in it. No one wants war. That should be avoided. That is the purpose of NATO. It's a defensive collective, but they shouldn't get in the mode of looking weak and responding, particularly because they're a consensus alliance that makes it difficult to get everybody on the same page, but they shouldn't project weakness because of that need to get consensus. Instead, they should project strength, but also wisdom.
Mm-hmm. That's a good analysis there. Just a brief question as well, because you touched on it earlier, of saying how NATO was a little bit more, let's say, had challenges some years ago when you started, especially in Brussels, looking at European defense policy. And I think we're seeing that shift now as well. We're not quite sure if for better or for worse, as we're hearing rumblings of potentially a commissioner for defense in the European Commission after these elections in June. We're looking at more European defense policy. How much, let's say, parity do these two policies have? Can they really work together? Can European EU policy on defense work in conjunction with NATO, or is there going to be some kind of overlap, and how do you assess it in your time working with the organization?
I have a very positive view of where we are now in that respect, because the challenge before is with the European Union, you had some significant players which were not members of NATO, and you had some significant members of NATO that weren't part of the EU. And because of those differences, it created challenges sometimes. Now, with 32 members, with Sweden and Finland joining, I think the number of EU members that are also part of NATO make this a much easier process of aligning European Union defense policy with the Euro-Atlantic defense policy. And so I actually think this is a very positive thing. The European Union should have those different places where it goes and talks about its defense and its expenditures and how it's going to share responsibilities and so forth. But then it can come together in greater alignment in the Euro-Atlantic alliance with the United States and ensuring that the broader NATO can actually take benefit from that. So I think it's going to be a positive thing.
All right. So I think on that positive front, I think we'll leave it there. We'll leave it on 75 years of success. And I think listening to your input there, it's going to only get better and stronger as this alliance continues to hold strong.
To another 75 years more.
Yeah.
Happy birthday, NATO. Thank you.
Happy birthday. Thank you so much for joining us.
Daniel Speckhard there. Thank you so much.